So what we've been talking about is, and what Alex Craner was talking about, is the London and Paris financiers are going broke. Their strategy was to encircle, economically strangle, and disintegrate Russia into a whole bunch of different oblasts. That was the Wolfowitz doctrine talked about how the West wanted to be the only superpower. So to do that, they want to disintegrate Russia, break it into oblasts, but then the Europeans have a different angle because Britain and France want to stay as major colonial powers. If you bring Russia in as a whole, well then Russia will develop into a major power and eclipse Great Britain and France.
You're watching Capital Cause, and my name is Danny. It is May 12th, 2025, and today's guest is a very special one. It's a PMC analyst, a private military contractor. His name is George. George, thank you so much for coming on the show, my friend.
Oh, it's great to be here. Longtime fan, watching you and Martin and Tom Luongo and Alex Craner. It's very complimentary to what I do. Yeah,
so if you guys are fans of any one of those three, then you guys are in for a treat. George just has you've been DMing me on messaging apps, on messaging app that we use, nonstop with all this data and information. And, it's just very in-depth, detailed stuff that I haven't seen anywhere else. So I'm very excited to, for you to share some of this stuff with the audience. So let's go ahead and dive right in here, George. But for people who may not know who you are, give us a little brief background on yourself. Who are you exactly?
Oh, I have master's degree in international relations from St. John's. I have another master's degree in political theory and comparative ideological systems. And I have an MPA from St. John's. So then I went, I wanted to go get a doctorate, but they kind of flunk out conservatives, or it's been a hostile environment for conservatives, always has been. I went to work in Iraq and Afghanistan instead as a private military contractor. Yeah, I worked, like I was telling you off screen, I started out, as the new guy doing vehicle explosion detection checkpoints around Baghdad till I moved into the operations center, started writing reports and started doing different types of strategic analysis and atmospheric intelligence and things like that. And then it went from Baghdad, Bagram, and Kabul, worked in operations centers there. So yeah, I learned a lot through the process, especially in Afghanistan, because it's the Taliban always ran shadow governments. So it's an irregular warfare, insurgency, counterinsurgency type of situation. So yeah, but most of the information I have really comes from the Long War Journal, because they really track all the different terrorist organizations occurring in the area. So yeah, most of the information is still open source. There's nothing really classified, really. It's just the information's always out there. War on the Rocks is another good one. But yeah, from doing that kind of work, and learning how the different terrorist organizations work, and then seeing that they seem to be extremely very well armed and very well equipped. And, guns and ammo only falls out of the sky when, from cargo helicopters and cargo airplanes. So you start to realize there's a lot of nation state complicity occurring here on the different sides. So you kind of figure out a lot of stuff that you're not privy to, but it's the information's out there in open source. So yeah, I learned a lot from that process. So I was working on how to laterally integrate the disciplines, unified behavioral theory, intercausal model of social sciences. I don't want to get too heavily into that. I want to key on integrating, political, economic, demographic, and geopolitical models, because you can take Aristotle's 6 forms of government. It covers the full range of human behavior, and you can match that to the per capita GDP function to get economic rates of change over demographic rates of change. If you I took the old first, second, third world category systems for geopolitics, and I just added a fourth world failed state category. That way you have two gradations of first and second world countries and two gradations of less developed countries. So then they're delineated over the more developed countries have higher economic growth, lower population growth, so they have a tighter wage labor market scale, equilibrium rate. And then less developed countries tend to be the obvious opposite, lower economic growth, higher population growth. So they have much lower wage labor rate scale. So as we're talking about, off screen with the global population going from 1 billion people in 1800, it took 150 million years of hominids on the earth to hit 1 million people. So you have a very flat trajectory till 1800, and then it just skyrockets to 8 billion. Well, over the past, 200 years, population growth has been drastically outstripping global economic growth. So that's the chief reason why you have such plummeting wage labor equilibrium rates globally, especially since 1950, because they're moving jobs south and people north. So if you have the two, I'm using this models to track the two trends of population growth, technology and population growth over time as the two primary trends. Then the two secondary trends are jobs moving south to where the raw materials and the high unemployed are. So then people also moving north. So you have high migration rates of industry moving south and people moving north. So what you have occurring globally is a global wage labor equilibrium process occurring. So once you have those global atmospherics as a constant that all countries are operating in, you can take complexity theory and get that as a constant, and then how the different countries are acting within that environment is how I develop my chaos theory models, because then that's the area where people are having different domestic and foreign policies in strategic interaction with each other. So once you have an integrated causal model of politics, economic, and geopolitical pattern recognition frameworks, then I can build geoeconomic models, because geoeconomics is about getting raw materials out of the ground, so minerals, energy, minerals, agriculture, turning it into a consumer product, and then distributing it. Once you know the fundamentals of that, geopolitics is the opposite. You're trying to sabotage your rivals at each and every logistical supply route. Every time it's being transferred you only have sea, land, and air. Every time something's being moved, you're trying to sabotage a rival's ability to move those products to get them together and deliver it. So once you do that, those vulnerability points, using SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities, threats, that becomes your targeting packages on different domains that the military uses. Well, the different institutional levels of warfare, I got them listed at the bottom of the slide set. That's where the banking center gets the government to use this institutional levels to start to enhance the ability to align your allies, and starts interfering with the rival's ability to do that. All right, let me go to the bottom of the slide set.
Okay. Let's go ahead and make sure it's shared. Okay, go ahead.
And then I want your audience, because you have a lot of MBAs in your audience, I want them to see how I set up the methodologies. So it's I'm presenting a little bit different for your audience.
Gotcha.
Because then once they see the methodologies of how I'm building my models, they'll see how I'm getting arriving at my answers.
All right.
So what we want to get back to is why Trump's foreign policy team is absolutely clueless, is where we're going with this.
And this is in regards to Ukraine or just in general?
Oh, well, it's in Ukraine was what we're going to be talking about today. But since the proxy wars are in every single country around Eurasia, all trying to take over, well, you're trying to geostrategics, you're looking at taking over maritime choke points, riverine ports, and terrestrial land bridge choke points. You want to take over energy, mineral, and agricultural products to send it to your, to manufacturing centers that you own, so the profits go back to Wall Street, London, Paris, Brussels, and Basel, the banking center. So it's those variables that you're tracking with geopolitical stuff. So right here on this slide set, you have the grand strategic level, which is basically in the banking center, because they're figuring out.
George, really quick. It says Daniel Suckman up there. I'm assuming that's where you get this diagram from.
Oh, correct. Yeah, that's I'm making sure I make my citations correct.
Gotcha.
So I don't plagiarize. It's from the Strategy Bridge. He published it back in 2016. The grand strategic level is actually in the banking center. It's never been in the government. Ever since the British and Dutch East India days, or Dutch East India days, it's always been in the banking community. Then they always operate through the institutional levels of the government. So in the military, the enlisted people are basically trained at the tactical level. Officers are basically at the operational level, because you're trying to get men and material in theater. And then the generals are basically trained at the theater strategic level. Mm. So the problem with Trump's team is he's got these military guys that are trained in the bottom three levels. You take someone like Mike Waltz of Special Forces, it's worse, because they don't do strategic level. They do small unit tactics and kill capture missions and things like that, and indigenous training and that kind of stuff. So they're really at the bottom two levels. They don't understand that the degree that the banking center, now let me shift over.
Yeah, they don't see the broader vision.
No, they don't. And I want to get down to, oh, wait, this one doesn't have it. Or I moved it. Oh, no, here it is. So at the top of this slide set, I listed the 4 strategic levels. Okay. The 9 institutional levels for my model is the financial centers. They have a global hierarchy of their own. Mm-hmm. Then you have the global domestic business world hierarchy. Okay. The reason why that is significant is business worlds have analysts and accountants. So if you look at the number of analysts and accountants they have, it's going to dwarf the number of analysts that are in the intelligence community. All right. So the banking centers also fund, the different graduate students in the university system. And so they're picking who they want out of there. The 4th level, is the hierarchy of global research foundations. So they're funding the research institutions, think tanks, MacArthur Foundation, Carnegie, stuff like that. For think tanks, the big ones are going to be International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, or Institute for Study of War in DC, or American Enterprise Institute, Brookings Institute, CSIS, where Brzezinski used to work. Those different think tanks. Anybody that doesn't follow the narrative never gets past the internship level. So they start weeding people out. It's all loyalty to the narrative is what they want. So the last thing that they want is somebody in there like me that starts figuring out comparative ideological models from base assumptions forward. Because they don't want people up with comparative models to start to say, wait a second, what you're saying can't be right. So then you get into, they do the same thing in the intelligence community. since the university system is overly compartmentalized, people are overly specialized. Then they go into the government, that secret compartmented information. So they're siloed also. So you get people that are so siloed and can't cross-reference information on all these different domains. So the same thing happens in the intelligence community. So then you have, the different federal military departments, like I listed above, that have the, strategic, operational, and tactical levels of training. But you have the same thing occurring in the business world too. Let me shift away from this real quick. Yeah, you have the same thing in the business world. You just call it something else, but it's the same kind of pyramid. You have the same thing in government. It's the same kind of pyramid where you bring people at the bottom and then you move, the better people, or the people that you want, you promote through the, through the different areas, and they, by working different jobs at different periods of their career, hopefully they learn the grand strategic level of the business by the time they get to the C-suite, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing in the military. Let me go back to my domain levels. All right. So the reason why I say that is the different civilian law enforcement and civilian executive branch agencies, like Department of Interior, Department of Energy, those different areas, they have the same levels. But switch back to this. It's still the banking centers that control all the governmental domains.
And they're at the grand strategic level.
Right.
Okay.
So like we were talking about before, you talked about what General Wesley Clark was talking about in his 2007 campaign speeches, the 5 country, or the 7 countries in 5 years. Mm-hmm. We were already in Afghanistan, so it's really 8 countries in 5 years. And those were, he names them in random order. I name them in geographical order. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and then in North Africa, it's Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. So I name them in that order because then you can see what they wanted to do was take over. Okay, there's no agriculture in that area to speak of, so it's energy they want. So they want the energy, and they want the logistical supply routes back to Europe. I have another detailed slide set. Yes, the whole reason of global war on terror had nothing to do with terror. It was all about moving into the Middle East and taking over the resources and the logistical supply routes.
Isn't that what the Qatar-Turkey pipeline was all about? Was cutting through? Right. That was the entire purpose of, or one of the big reasons for ousting Assad in Syria.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, AQI, Al Qaeda in Iraq was dead in 2011. Somehow they got massive amounts of armaments and started overthrowing Assad. The whole, Free Syrian Army, we're like, whenever you talk about Sunni violent extremist organizations, you're like, well, what's the difference between the Free Syrian Army and ISIS and Al Qaeda? You start thinking, oh, there is none. Mm-hmm. They just, over time, they just rename the different groups that they arm for the American population. And it's been like that, for the American public. It's been that way ever since, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Stansfield Turner armed the Mujahideen in Operation Cyclone in the late 1970s.
But it's really comical what they did in Syria. I mean, they put like a suit on this guy, Al-Jalani. They even changed his name to Al-Shara. It's like they gave him a complete makeover, even though he had spent a good deal of his time in these ISIS camps before.
Oh yeah, and then and the reason why I put up the 9 levels of warfare is, how can such a 0.001% of the world's population totally, hoodwink, billions of people? Well, they control all 9 levels. So they're controlling, the university system and the media and the think tanks that put out the information that gets put on cable news. With over the past decade, with all those video montages where cable news or even local news will of across the United States or the Western world will phrase the same event using the same words and the same framing techniques all day long, all week long. It's really obvious somebody's writing the scripts. And when you look at BlackRock and Vanguard that have shares of stocks in the different media companies, then you start to understand. Oh, and then they finance the business community so they can either use their stock pressure to manipulate the media companies to fire a Tucker Carlson or somebody, or they get their advertisers not to advertise on somebody's show. So they start to use these levers to oust people they don't like, because they're taking over resources, again, energy, mineral, and agricultural commodities, to send to their manufacturing centers so the profits go back to their own banking systems. But they have to tell the public they're doing something else, because you can't tell that we're going to mobilize a big, huge army to invade, the 8 countries in 5 years, because we want to take over their commodities and the logistical supply routes, because then it would be really obvious that the grand strategic level is using the military to socialize the losses and privatize the profits, which is exactly what's occurring. You can't say that. They have to use a cover for action narrative. So how does the cover for action narrative get put out and hoodwink? You're talking about billions of people on the planet, right? Well, they control all of these levels. So even in
the banking sector, that is, right?
Say again?
Is that who you're referring to, the banking sector controlling all these levels?
Correct. Okay. Correct. So, that's how a very small percentage of the population controls such a dissemination of information. And then it's, one thing you see on alternative media is how well funded these groups are that spout the narrative right back. The Operation Mockingbird channels.
Right.
So we're looking at some of this stuff. We're like, it's got to take $20,000 or $30,000 a month to run these operations. These aren't YouTube channels. And then Mike Benz and Doge have been finding out, they're getting billions of dollars are spent funding these different Operation Mockingbird channels. Especially, Mike Benz and Elon Musk have been discovering that all over the place.
Is that from USAID, or does it go beyond USAID?
Oh, USAID and National Endowment for Democracy. But when Musk took over X, he found that FBI and CISA were funding a lot of it, because they're taking down misinformation.
I see. And this is your brainchild right here. These 9 institutional domains. You're not, you've pretty much created this based off of your own.
Yeah, there is that Chinese guy did write Unrestricted Warfare several years ago. I don't use his model. I use my own, but it could be kind of similar. I would have to really go back and read his book, but I did this model. Yeah, I did this one on my own, to answer your question.
Gotcha.
But the Unrestricted Warfare, I forget the guy's name who published that several years ago. It could be similar. I haven't read the book. It's sitting around here someplace, but I did this model myself, because you have to explain how just such a small percentage of the people, control such a vast amount of information flow in so many different areas.
Right.
I developed this model because I have another very long slide set that explains how Jim Thompson of the OSS first went into Bangkok in 1945 as the Japanese were leaving. They had less than 1,000 miles of paved road in Thailand. Well, 20 years later, they have an elaborate, railway and highway network, a very elaborate, all the oil companies moved in, did all this offshore drilling. They have pipeline routes. The big agricultural companies moved in and really developed their agricultural system, turned the whole country into, a big farm, basically. They created a big petrochemical manufacturing because they have a lot of rubber tree plantations plus the oil and gas. So the different tire manufacturers moved in there. And then, next door in Laos and Cambodia, it doesn't have that because they turned communist. So you're like, well, how did this happen? Well, once DOD and CIA and U.S. Army Corps of Engineer moved in, they were trying to feed the needed Air Force bases to help the French in Dien Bien Phu in the first Indochina War. So they started building the Air Force bases and the roads to it up to Laos. And when the French lost in Dien Bien Phu and the Ho Chi Minh Trail started moving into eastern Laos, well, then they had to move the Air Force bases and the roads to the Mekong River to the east. So every time they do this, the agricultural you have the big construction companies that move in. And how do they move in? Well, the different levels of government are interacting with and developing the government agencies in Thailand. So they do a mirror image of our different governmental institutions. They do a mirror image with the host nation. Then they start training the local nationals, in State Department speak. On the military side, they start doing indigenous training. Same thing. So once you see how once CIA and DOD moved into Thailand, it's all of these institutions and the Fortune 500 companies just descend on the place. So after watching how that works, you start to see the pattern replicated. So this is how I developed these levels on my own. This is my version from looking at what happened in Southeast Asia from 1945 to present.
Right. So let's apply this to a modern day use case. Let's apply this to Ukraine. What exactly is happening in Ukraine right now? It seems like Trump wasn't able to get a peace deal done within 24 hours, let alone 100 days. What are we seeing happening today in Ukraine? You kind of alluded to the fact that he has people from the tactical and operational level leading this thing, where it should be more so strategic and beyond. If that's correct me if I'm wrong. I want to get your take on Ukraine. What's going on there with Ukraine?
Yeah, let's let's break into this real quick because I want to now we're actually kind of back on track of how I develop my models. So here in this slide, Trump was on with Christine Welker, I think is her name. And he's going on and on about how Russia wants all of Ukraine. Russia wants all of Ukraine. Well, that's not true.
If you're looking for great deals on gold and silver, coins and bars from a company that you can trust, then you've got to check out the good folks over at Pimbex. This year, I've really gotten to know these guys, and all I can say is you're not going to deal with a better group of people. They're a family-owned gold and silver online bullion company offering the essentials and more at industry-leading prices while always providing first-class top-tier service. That's PIMBEX.com. And if you're looking to convert some or all of your retirement account into real gold and silver, give Pimbex a call. They'll help explain the process and get you started on the right path. Your support at Pimbex also helps support the channel. So reach out to Pimbex today. You won't be disappointed. And make sure to tell them Danny sent you.
A lot of Americans don't realize the different ethnic, religious, and linguistic rivalries that are in these countries. What the United States was talking about for the last 20 years was if Russia invades, they're going to have a fallback plan of counterinsurgency to keep Russia invading. Well, Russia can read Stars and Stripes and Army Times Online also. They knew that that was going to happen. In March of 2022, when this war kicked off, General Petraeus was on LinkedIn. Someone actually sent me one of his articles, and I commented on it. I thought it was just a repost. I didn't realize it was his page. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. But I wrote on it that, no, Russia's not going to do that. They're going to stay in the Russian-speaking areas. They're not going to want to get bogged down in insurgency. All they want to do is protect their seaports, and because it's their only warm water port. And they want to protect their naval base in Crimea. They'll never go beyond the Russian-speaking areas. So why do I have this map up? What's in yellow is the Russian-speaking areas. What's in red is the Catholic Ukrainian areas, basically. So Russia's going to stay out of there and just protect their vital interests. In the Don River is their only southward flowing river that goes into Rostov-on-Don. So that's where all their minerals and agricultural products come out of. Then they have to go through the Kerch Strait, Bosphorus Strait, Dardanelles Strait. Then you're still trapped in the Mediterranean, where you either got to go through Straits of Gibraltar or the Suez. So they're going through a whole bunch of different maritime choke points. So knowing that Russia is their vital interest is just to stay in those areas and protect their critical structure. And here's a religious breakdown map. That's countries. But here's the 2014 electoral map, where what's in blue, they overwhelmingly voted for Yanukovych, who was ousted in the 2014 Euromaidan revolution.
You cut out when you pulled up the religious map. Can you go back to the religious map and do that over again?
Yeah, this is a basic map. You have the Russian Orthodox in the east. You have Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox in the middle. The left tends to be Catholic Ukrainian in the Galician area. That's where the hardcore Stepan Bandera followers are from. The U.S. training bases were all in the Lvov, Galicia area. So then they trained and equipped these Bandera partisans and moved them where? They moved them to Mariupol and into the east, into the Russian-speaking areas, right next to Rostov-on-Don. They did that in 2014. And there's videos out there. I think the Gray Zone with Aaron Matei and Max Blumenthal have covered this. A bunch of other people where they show Lindsey Graham talking to these, they're neo-Nazi groups in Mariupol. Well, if you put heavy tanks, rockets, and offensive weaponry within 100 miles of Rostov-on-Don, their only warm water port, and where Russia has their Black Sea Fleet since 1783, when Catherine the Great took over Crimea from the Turks. Well, that's a pre-attack indicator that you're amassing troops and you have opportunity, intent, and capability. Those are your three criteria for an imminent attack, for pre-attack indicators. It tells when an adversary, what stage they are in an attack cycle. So Russia responded by supporting the Russian speakers in the Donbass and asking for a ceasefire. So this whole war started over an argument of whether they're going to have a highly federalized concentration of political power in Kiev or a more federalized system like we have here in the United States or Switzerland. So that was the start of the war from a political point of view. From the geostrategic point of view, Russia's protecting their logistical supply routes, their naval base, and Rostov-on-Don. So when Trump starts talking about Russia wants all of Ukraine in his interview, whoever is advising him on this is complete nonsense, because Russia's going to stay the hell out of that orange area. Mm-hmm. Why would you take that over? It's just going to be You're just going to have to face, guerrilla warfare. Why would you want to do that? They're just going to stay in the yellow areas. So he's being misadvised on that point. Now let's get into, we'll bypass that. Now let's get into let's just run through the main points and then we'll kind of go back and talk about it. So what we've been talking about is, and what Alex Craner was talking about, is the London and Paris financiers are going broke. Their strategy was to encircle, economically strangle, and disintegrate Russia into a whole bunch of different oblasts. That was the Wolfowitz doctrine talked about how the West wanted to be the only superpower. So to do that, they want to disintegrate Russia, break it into oblasts, but then the Europeans have a different angle because Britain and France want to stay as major colonial powers. If you bring Russia in as a whole, well, then Russia will develop into a major power and eclipse Great Britain and France. Well, they want to still pretend they're colonial powers. So they move the EU and NATO eastward because they want to establish a lot of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers because they want to stop Russian growth. What they're really trying to stop is a Russian export-led growth strategy that would fund, support an import substitution and investment modernization strategy that would make Russia a major power again. All right. The next step is, because you're talking about sea power versus overland logistical supply route land power strategies. The strategy for Russia and China is to build overland logistical supply routes that the U.S. Navy can't cut off at the maritime choke points. The problem with that is if China started heavily revising and building pipelines into the Central Asian stands, so they're heavily energy, mineral, and agriculturally rich. So they want to build overland logistical supply routes and feed those commodities to their huge industrial power centers and then export them to the world. Well, if you add Russian energy and commodities to that mix, then that makes China, it gives them just an endless supply of resources to feed in their industrial power. Well, then you're going to have the Eurasian Economic Union between Russia, the Central Asian stands, and China that's going to rival the European Economic Union. So how do you stop that? You stop Russia from getting to first base. Then in that scenario, Russian natural gas becomes the big problem because it's a monopoly by Gazprom. So 100% of that material, of that natural gas that profits, goes into the Russian bank accounts for them to fund their export-led growth strategy. So contrary to what the Western narrative is, it's not to stop, moving NATO and the EU east. It's got nothing to do with stopping their military expansion. It's to stop their market expansion. And then, France and Britain don't want to bring them in as a whole, so they want to disintegrate Russia into oblasts and take it over. Because if the Eurasian Economic Union starts, well, then it can absorb the ASEAN into a super trading bloc.
I see.
Then that will eventually dwarf the EU. So this whole thing is over. The banking community is using the Wolfowitz doctrine and the Rand, overextending and unbalancing Russia, the Rand 2019 articles, as their strategic plans to stop a Russian export-led growth strategy. So then everything that they put in the mass media is a false cover for action narrative. The problem with Trump's team is they come out of Fox News, which gets their news from the think tanks, which is all the false cover for action narrative. The real strategic models are done in the banking community by their PhD economists that they send to the Yale Grand Strategy schools or the Oxford Grand Strategy schools also. Mahan he went to Annapolis and taught at West Point and Naval War College in Newport. Mackinder was at Oxford and then also teaches at the different institutes in London, working with the City of London. So that's why those two banking centers take their PhD economists, because they're going to understand economic development theory. So then they just got to teach them the sea power versus land power theories of maritime, riverine, port, and terrestrial land bridge logistical supply route choke points. They can put the two things together and then run the 9 institutional levels. So they're doing that and keeping their models proprietary. What I did on Energy Newsbeat, and I have my link below of my Telegram channel where I started putting these geostrategic models. I made some basic models. Okay, they're very dense reads, but I made them public and put them out in the domain, because once you see what the actual geostrategic models are, well, then you see how the last 30 years of news is total nonsense. You start to understand the matrix, the degree of the matrix that we live in. So,
hey, George, really quick, what do you make of this seeming relationship being formed right now with China and the EU as a result of Trump's trade war? Is that something to be watchful of, or is not quite yet?
Putin's plan is since they were trying to bankrupt Russia, now Russia and China have gotten together, and they've since 2014. If they were concentrating on building overland logistical supply routes before the 2014 Euromaidan revolution, color revolution, that removed all doubt of what the Western intentions were. So then they've been redoubling their overland logistical supply route strategies to be autarkic. In the history of economic literature, they're looking at Raoul Prebisch, Hans Singer models on that. That's where those strategic models come from. So Putin is going to go ahead and let the banking centers collapse because he's in a position to do so. Once you know that, all she is doing is lining up to get, it's kind of given to, in my view, a false hope that they can do business, because now with the bank, their debt to GDP ratios are astoundingly high, as Alex Prainer has been talking about. So they're more and more desperate to take over these different resources. She knows that. He's going to go ahead and let them collapse, but he still wants to set up a deal on the rebound, because if the AfD, if the populist parties take power, whether it be Nigel Farage, UK Reform in Britain, AfD with Alice Weidel in Germany, or the FPO with Herbert Kickl in Austria, they want to do business with them afterwards. They can start to set those negotiations up now for a political change that Putin is trying to affect. So no, I think the EU is grasping at straws that somehow she is going to be their savior. Oh no, why would he do that? Just let them collapse and deal with them later, but you'll be dealing with the populist parties in a free trade initiative. Okay, why is that important? If the EU, if the Eurasian Economic Union solidifies, which it has been, and absorbs Asian countries, and Putin moves into Odessa, which is a Russian-speaking area, and the populist parties win in Moldova, where Maya Sandu is not very popular. She's the Harvard Kennedy School puppet that runs Moldova. Well, okay, she's got another 4 years, but the parliamentary elections are coming up. Since they're energy prices have soared, cost of living has sunk. She's going to lose the parliamentary elections. The populists are going to take over in Moldova if Georgescu or now it's Simeon takes over in Romania. And the other populists take over up and down the Danube River Valley. You already have Fico in Slovakia, Orban in Hungary, and Vucic in Serbia. Well, if they all become populists, they switch back to taking Russian natural gas to revive their economies and start to pay down their debts. Mm-hmm. Well, with the sanctions, they have to leave the petrodollar and they have to leave the EU, and they're going to ditch NATO. Well, in that scenario, you have the Eurasian Economic Union, the Asian Economic Union forming with what I call a Danube River Valley trading bloc. So then you have a mega trading bloc of Eurasia. And all Putin has to do is nothing but stay on his course of action, and that's going to happen. Kind of moving ahead of myself in the slide set here. We're actually, getting to the point. These banking centers are the same people that did the Steele dossier and the Russian collusion hoax, the same people that framed up George Papadopoulos, working back and forth with the different think tanks in DC and the different law firms, the same people that set up Michael Flynn. So you have an odd situation where the Kellogg plan of trying to get a ceasefire right now is trying to stop Putin from financially collapsing the people that were trying to financially collapse Putin, but it's the same people that are after Trump. So you kind of have to wonder, like, wait a second, why doesn't Trump follow Steve Bannon's advice and John Mearsheimer's advice and Jeffrey Sachs of just to unilaterally pull out of Ukraine, concentrate on the United States, let that collapse, and then he lets Putin get rid of the same enemies that are trying to actually physically assassinate him. So in the midst of this, Trump has people that are only trained at the lower strategic levels that don't realize this. So Putin is totally lost in this conversation with Welker. He thinks he's wrong about everything across the board. He thinks the Russians want all of Ukraine. No, they're just going to take the Russian part because that's the part that protects their critical trade route infrastructure. And Trump, what the banking center is trying to do is force Trump to either make it look like he's surrendering Ukraine, make him look like a Neville Chamberlain, so he'll lose the midterms, or he has to fund, or he feels he's got to fund Ukraine for another $40 billion. Then he goes back on his word about ending the forever wars, and he loses his base. They're trying to put him in a can't win scenario. So, and he's falling with his present foreign policy team. He's being steered into that trap. He doesn't realize what trap he's in. So he's actually falling for it. Now he's starting to own that Ukraine war, and he's getting very nervous because he was originally told, you had Sebastian Gorka on Newsmax every night. He was going to deal with Putin from a position of strength and bully Putin what to do. Well, that's not working out because Russia and China have been planning this for years with their overland logistical supply routes and trying to build, markets of scale and economies of scale so they are less dependent on United States markets. If you throw India in the mix with another 1.7 billion people, they can survive. Now, India and China don't have to like each other. All they need to do is just get the energy, mineral, and agricultural commodities out of Russia and the Eurasian stands. So when you get into why the banking community wants that war with Iran so badly. Well, they have to use the nuclear aspect as a red herring because they can't admit they're going broke. Their debt to GDP ratios are skyrocketing. Cost of living's gone up. They're deindustrializing, and with the job losses, their productivity's going down, or it's certainly not growing. No, it's sinking. So they're in a really desperate straits to take over not only the Iranian natural gas sources. Let me switch down to my map so people can look. I'll use this map. They also want the oil and natural gas out of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, but they can't have the pipelines going through Russia. They need them going through Iran. Particularly what they want is, let me switch to, they want to extend that Tabriz pipeline all the way to Turkmenistan, or build a Trans-Caspian pipeline to send it to Europe before the banking centers collapse and or the populist parties take over in the Danube River Valley. So now they're in a desperate race because Nigel Farage is ahead of Keir Starmer in the polls there. The Frederick Merz, he's having trouble getting a coalition in Germany. And as he's backtracking on his promises, more people are leaving the CDU, SPD or SPU, and going over to the AFD. A similar thing is occurring in Austria. So if they become populist and rebuild Nord Stream, then you have enough natural gas within a year or two to feed not only Germany, but the whole German industrial speaking world of Switzerland, Austria, Liechtenstein, and then the whole Danube River Valley Slavic world as well. If you build all four pipelines, there's 3 damaged, there's 1 good one.
Hey, George, really quick, what is that a map of? Is that that's not a Caspian?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is the pipelines in Turkey.
In Turkey, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's Turkey. Got it. I thought
I'm sorry.
The ocean there with the blue there. Okay, got it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about it. It's the Anatolian Peninsula. Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, because if you get into what happened in Syria with the natural gas ending in going through the Brisbane pipeline in Ukraine, well, then you understand what the trade-off was between Putin and Erdogan was in Turkey. All of a sudden now all the natural gas flows through Turkey, so he's kind of got a monopoly on that. And people are like, oh, they cut off Russian natural gas by pipeline, but we're sending them LNG at twice the price. And people don't realize that's LNG is a maritime coping strategy. It's a sea power coping strategy. It's not a long-term solution, because natural gas by pipeline, when you amortize the price of building the pipeline over 20 or 30 years, they last longer. It goes down to dirt cheap. So there's no way LNG can compete with natural gas by pipeline. Well, what Erdogan did was with Putin was probably make a deal that they'll continue with Turkstream. Turkstream is the pipelines going from the Novorossiysk area to central Turkey.
Okay.
So, they made some kind of deal there. I don't want to get into that. I want to stick with this one. It's another topic, but just to give people an idea of why that's such a key geographical location. And Erdogan has to play everybody off against each other, but not too much. So he can only stray so far. No, but that whole deal was prearranged.
The Syrian deal is what you're saying.
The Syrian deal. Yeah. It's all over pipelines, because even if they built the Qatar pipeline through, all right, I got to back up a second. You have a Sunni controlled Qatar a Sunni Arab controlled Saudi Arabia, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, KSA, Sunni controlled Jordan, you had Shia controlled Syria. And that was what the big bloc was. So they needed to replace that with a Sunni government. So they did that with the Sunni VEOs of HTS. But they're funding the Free Syrian Army. Al Qaeda in Iraq is what became ISIS and Al Qaeda. I mean, that became ISIS. You also had the Al Qaeda groups in there.
Yeah. Well, Syria. I mean, wasn't Syria Alawite? Wasn't Assad an Alawite?
Assad's an Alawite Shia.
Mm-hmm.
And they had Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed militia that's Shia Arab. So you have all these different groups. Now the Alawites are on the Latakia coast, where Russia still has their 2 bases. They're over there. But now they could theoretically build their pipelines all the way up to Sunni Turkey. So they wanted to make it so it goes through the Sunnis the whole way. There's also a lot of end times prophecy going on here. Another topic for another day, though. So what I wanted to stick on was the whole thing about Iran is they have weapons of mass destruction all over again. They're going back to that play. So they desperately want to invent a reason to attack Iran. So they're using the nuclear. They're telling the military guys, Kellogg and Waltz and Radcliffe and all those guys, that they have weapons of mass destruction. We must attack now. Well, those guys are on the operational and tactical ends. They get their orders. They say, yes, sir. Okay. The reason why I lay out my models in that geoeconomic, geostrategic targeting packages models is the military guys are only focused on the last end. The underlying reasons of why they're doing that is on the other end of the model, the geostrategic end, which is solely in the domain of the PhD economists that work for finance and economy majors that work for the banking system. So the military guys don't understand the underlying rationale because they don't have access to those models, which is why I posted the links on my Telegram channel so people can find them. It's a public channel. The joke here is whoever out there in the audience can send them to Lavrov and Medvedev so they can send the links to Witkoff so he can learn how to do this modeling. Because right now you have the really bizarre situation where Putin and Lavrov and Medvedev and Peskov have to explain what the land power versus sea power strategies are to Witkoff so that he can then learn how to negotiate this. We are in a bizarro world. It should be our Western institutions that are giving these models to Witkoff and training them up on how to do this. Well, Trump had 4 years to plan about this. He doesn't know that this stuff exists. Well, as do almost 99.99% of the people on the planet. From a bizarre set of circumstances, I know how to do it and I know it exists. So that's why I started putting those models on my Telegram channel because, Alex Trainer's right. The banking system is about to go broke. They need to collateralize their debt. They need the U.S. military to take it over. They can't come out and say that because they don't have an intelligence community. So they're telling the Israeli Mossad to start talking about the nuclear threat because they have to use somebody else's intelligence community to make that a plausible scenario. So you have the entire the neocons in Trump's government have totally bought into this, or they're paid off, one or the other. that they need to attack Iran right now before they get a nuclear weapon. Oh, no. The reason is the banking center is going broke and the populist parties are about to take over. That's the sense of urgency. And if they can stall Trump into taking this step, he loses his base, or he walks away from Ukraine like a Neville Chamberlain, and then he loses the midterms, and then they impeach him in January of 2027. That's the trap that they're trying to get him into. Instead, he should just leave Ukraine, and I've put all the models up, and he should expose the scam. That's what he needs to do. So that's why, I posted my models all up on Telegram.
I see. So this pretty much explains Ukraine and Iran simultaneously, because they're all interconnected, and then Syria's right smack dab. But Syria's kind of like the nexus point between the two conflicts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't have a big map up here, but the United States first moved in, into GWAT to take over the Middle East. The 8 countries in 5 years is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. So yeah, you want to take over. You're taking over the terrestrial land bridge choke points is what you're taking over, because you got where the Baku-Tbilisi pipeline is going through Azerbaijan and Georgia. So you're taking over. Can you see my cursor between Baku and Tbilisi, Georgia? Because you're taking over the terrestrial land bridge choke point between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea.
Mm-hmm.
By the U.S. moving into the Middle East during the global war on terror, you're also taking over the area between the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Persian Gulf.
And this effectively throws a wrench into the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, big time. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And is that what the conflict between Pakistan and Iran is about as well?
Oh, okay. Well,
not Iran, India. Sorry, India. Yes.
Yeah, I was sending you those links. On Signal there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. China's Silk Road program, and I've been writing about this since 2011. China's Silk Road program is over establishing overland logistical supply routes to the energy-rich Caspian Sea area on into Iran, so the United States can't cut them off on Strait of Hormuz or Strait of Malacca or South China Sea. The Belt and Road Initiative is to extend those logistical supply routes to the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean. So any ships coming from cargo ships or oil or gas can be offloaded at either Charbahar port, which is just outside in Sistan, Baluchistan, just outside the Strait of Hormuz, or Gwadar port in Pakistan, Baluchistan, which is in the Gulf of Oman, again, outside the Strait of Hormuz. They want to make it so they can offload cargo ships and send it straight to China without going through the Strait of Malacca, or send oil through the pipelines that way also. So if the United States has a naval power, is trying to choke them off with maritime choke points, the Silk and Belt and Road choke points is either an overland logistical supply route or a limited maritime breakout strategy. So they want to have the key factor of the Belt and Road Initiative is to get, it's a little bit different in each area, but on the western side, they want to have as many ports. So they can offload anything from Africa and send it overland and to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Or their present strategy in Southeast Asia of going through Laos and Cambodia and building that big canal in southern Cambodia, linking the Mekong to the Gulf of Thailand, is so they can send ships into the Mekong and then send stuff up by road through Laos up to Kunming into China. So you have a lot of conflict in Southeast Asia where they're fighting over these different logistical supply routes, which of course goes all the way back to 1945 of why the United States was trying to take over the different logistical supply routes in Southeast Asia. If you look at why the Chinese have their 9-dash line or 10-dash line of moving into the atolls in the Spratly Islands and those islands around between Vietnam and the Philippines, well, what they're telling the sea powers, the Anglosphere, Five Eyes countries, U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, is if you're going to cut off our oil and gas from the Middle East and Africa, well, we're going to cut off the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, the Western allies, from oil and gas, and collapse their economies also. This is something that people don't get about all those practice invasions, those joint force exercises that China does that go around Taiwan. Yeah, they're doing joint force exercises because the more you get your troops, doing that, the better they get at it, and it scares Taiwan. Yeah, totally get it. But what they really want is they want Japan to complete their Hokkaido to Sakhalin pipeline that goes under the sea. Shinzo Abe had built the pipelines all the way up to the northern end of Hokkaido when he was going to complete that tunnel. And Russia already built those their pipelines to the southern end under heavy diplomatic pressure from the United States. They built LNG liquefaction plants on one side, on the Russian side, and a regasification plant on the other. It would have been much cheaper just to build that pipeline. But here's the kicker. Once somebody becomes infrastructurally integrated with another power, they become economically integrated, diplomatically integrated, and militarily integrated. So you want to stop the infrastructural integration first, so it stops all the other ones. I have whole slide sets. If Russia attaches itself, integrates economically with its pipelines to Japan through the Sakhalin-Hokkaido pipeline, and to Germany, and to China, their goods become more competitive on the global market. Their cost of production and living standards goes down. I mean, their living standards go up, rather. South Korea would then have to complete the Seoul to Pyongyang to Vladivostok pipeline to stay competitive. Well, if those things occur, then those two countries that start to form the first island chain strategy of the United States strategies of containment, well, then they're going to switch sides to the Eurasian Economic Union again, as well. So it's not only that the European Economic Union and the Anglosphere trading blocks and military alliances fall apart. Well, then they join the Eurasian ASEAN Economic Union and the Danube River Valley trading bloc, and it becomes one big trading bloc. Then the United States and Canada is isolated. Well, the Wolfowitz and the Rand plan was designed to stop letting Russia integrate its pipelines to those other industrial power centers. So they were trying to stop that at first. All right, getting back to Iran. I just went all around Eurasia. Now I want to get back to what's going on in Iran. If Iran completes its Charbahar port, they can have a seaway port to Gujarat, Iran. But if the Baluch and the Sindh break away from Pakistan, then they don't have to have a sea link. They can build those pipelines straight across Baluch and Sindh to Gujarat, India. Then India has direct pipeline and railway routes to the Caspian Sea area and to Russia. So a lot of people surmise that attack up in Pahalgam was to ignite a big war up there between India and Pakistan. Really, they're trying to stop the that Charbahar port. It's not on the map here, but from where Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan meet is a place called Zahedan. Up north of that, on the Afghan side, is Herat. That railway between Chabahar port is supposed to go to Zahedan into Herat. Well, the Indians have been trying to build logistical supply routes to get the Afghanistan minerals. Pakistan was under Imran Khan during the collapse, during the United States fallout. Well, Imran Khan is Pashtun. If Imran Khan pulls the Pakistan Punjab army off the border control points, then the Pashtun on both sides, the Afghan Taliban and the Tariqi Taliban Pashtun, are then united because their goal was always to get rid of the Durand line between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Pashtun have always had from the Amudarya River in Tajikistan all the way over to the Indus River in Pakistan. That's the Durrani Empire. They want their land back. The British drew those lines, and then when they pulled out in 47, they divided their territory permanently. Well, same thing with Baluchistan. They drove the line through Sistan, Baluchistan, and Iran, and the Baluchistan, Pakistan. The Baluch want their territory back, and they want to be reunited as well. And they've been working with the Pashtun because they did in the past. Afghanistan went all the way to the sea. So you have all these different covert entities of everybody in the region and the major powers and superpowers trying to get these different separatist groups, because they're really more separatist groups than terrorist groups. And it's all over these logistical supply routes. So that attack up in Pahalgam is creating the opportunity. Well, wait, let me back up a second. The United States was definitely trying to stop the Pashtun from uniting on both. So Donald Yu of the U.S. State Department orchestrated that lawfaring and jailing of Imran Khan. Well, he's Pashtun. He would lead his rallies up in Peshawar, a Taliban stronghold. So they ended up jailing him to keep him from having his rallies in Peshawar. Well, that angered the Pashtun on both sides of the border. So now the Pashtun are uniting in discussions with the Iranians and the Baluch, because if they need to fund their government, Professor Christine Fair out of Georgetown has been talking about the problem with Afghanistan has always been they don't know how to fund their government. The United States has been sending plane loads of cash since we left Afghanistan into HKIA in Kabul to try to get the Taliban to back the different insurgents groups to blow up the Russian and Chinese pipelines in the Caspian Sea area. So it's Silk Road, Belt and Road, and stop the international north-south trade corridor in Iran. I realize people that are unfamiliar with these different groups and under which conditions they'll switch sides. It gets very confusing. I worked there for a long time. I realize for new listeners, it's very confusing, but they're trying to get them to flip-flop because they really want that pipeline. Well, the Indians would love to see that pipeline go through Baluchistan into Sindh into Gujarat. Well, that would make that Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN, Danube River Valley super mega block trading union. If you added India to that mix, you're adding another 1.7 billion people. So now you're talking about that would be the end of London and France as colonial powers and their banking system. Now, here's the kicker. The capital flows would start going to Moscow and Beijing. So the whole center you're talking about here is the global political center of gravity shifting from Wall Street and London, Paris, and Brussels to Moscow and Beijing and Berlin. So this whole thing starts.
Wait, Berlin? Berlin would be a recipient?
Oh yeah. Because you're uniting. If Alice Weidel takes over, then it's in the 20s and 30s, you had Frederick Karl Ratzel and Frederick Haushofer, I reversed that. But Ratzel and Haushofer always saying that Germany should always integrate with Russia for natural resources because the Ruhr Valley has a tremendous industrial capacity. So they always wanted them linked. The Habsburg Empire in Potsdam area in Thuringia now always wanted. Well, they were intermarried with Peter the Great, so they through those blood relations through the royal lines, they always wanted to integrate with Russia. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg to interact with. Well, I'll call it the Hanseatic League to deal with Germany. When you look at it in that historical perspective, the purpose of the Nord Stream pipeline was to reestablish that Hanseatic League another way, is to increase that logistical supply route integration. But in Mahan theory, you have production of raw materials, commodities. It doesn't become wealth until you can trade it and get goods that you don't have but need to economically develop. So you're talking about Adam Smith's theory of development is what Mahan read, and his Ricardo theory. So you're trying to convert production to wealth through trade and then economically develop, because Spain traded in gold and they traded it with England for finished goods. Well, then the Industrial Revolution happened in England and it didn't happen in Spain. If they used the gold to buy operating companies and build railroads and steam engines in Spain, then Spain would have had the Industrial Revolution alongside of England. So going from these, again, so much of this is the history of economic development theory.
Right. Hey, George, really quick, because I know we're coming up on time here in a bit. Explain to people who may not know, why is it that Britain and France are still considered heavily influential banking sectors in the world? I mean, isn't America, isn't Wall Street the real juggernaut here? I mean, you look at the UK, you look at France. I mean, they all seem like shadows of the past, but from what it seems, they still wield a lot of power. Can you explain why that is?
Oh yeah, it's through the derivatives markets. When they originally set up the banking centers during the colonial period, you still have so much of the resources going through Paris and London. What Raoul Prebisch was talking about was, and the old school dependency and structural school theorists during the Great Depression was, well, South America can't economically develop because they're just sending raw materials north. This is actually a very good and deep and good question, because once you start to explain this, you start to understand you get back to why they need Ukraine and Iran again. So as long as they're sending raw materials up to England, then they're economically developing, and the luxury goods can only be afforded by the rich in Latin America. So what they were arguing was they needed to start moving value-added industrial processing manufacturing facilities to Latin America so they could start to build out a sort of sectoral growth. So you're talking about Rostow's economic development theory, his 5 stages, and then you're talking about Baumol and Blinder's sectoral development strategies also. So you're using commodities export-led growth strategies to fund an import substitution investment modernization program. And then these old, I'm using old school language here. It's now advanced by, solo swan models and things like that. So with the population growth, like I was talking about earlier, you're moving the industrial manufacturing facilities out of the UK and Paris. And they're okay, especially when you start to look at rubber and tire manufacturers, moving them to where the rubber trees are, or the different other processing plants. They're moving the plants there to take closer to the raw materials. So they're combining the raw materials together from disparate places where it's logistically efficient. So your transportation costs are cheaper. Then you're shipping the finished goods throughout the world from a central shipping point that's cheaper. And since the population growth in the third world is rising, they're also gaining money on paying less in wages. But the profits still go to London and Paris. All right. What Alex Craner and Tom Luongo were talking about on your show not too long ago was the United States and Canada can collateralize their debt. But Britain no longer can collateralize their debt because they're too small of a country with not enough commodities. Well, what they've been doing over the past, especially since 1950, and you really see this after the World War II ended, they really pushed out, the Dutch went back into Indonesia. The English and the French went back into Southeast Asia. They're not colonial powers, but they own the stakes in the industrial processing centers they send there. So the profits still go back. So the banking system, as the political system changes, they still managed to direct the profits. They've adapted to direct the profits back to London and Paris and Brussels and Amsterdam. But so they've taken, and this is critical, they've taken the structural and dependency schools were trying to figure out how to make the world more equitable. And the same thing with Richard Oddy's resource curse theory, when he's talking about mineral development in North America. He was like, well, the multinational corporations fund these autocrats, so they have to pay them minimally until they can extract it maximally. Well, they use these old school economic development books not to make the world more equitable. They've used it as an owner's manual to make it less equitable. They've completely reversed the intentions of why these scholars wrote these books in the first place. If you combine that with the population growth rise, yes, they've had tremendous economic efficiency gains by moving first world jobs to the third world countries, developing world. They've maximized their profits, but the money isn't used to develop the first world countries anymore. It's still going to the rich elite, but it's global. So even though the United States is a bigger country with bigger productivity power and Wall Street is technically bigger, you're still talking about so much money, because you're talking about a global velocity of money is what you're occurring that's still flowing through principally the city of London, because they set up all these banking centers around the world to shift, in the Caribbean. Well, the bigger one now is the Dubai financial center. The Arabs can't use usury, so they carved out an area that could charge interest rates in Dubai. And who did they get to do that? Well, they used the city of London
as the model. Yeah, you were telling me about this.
Yeah. Okay, so that square mile, a lot of people don't know about the square mile city of London. It's really separate. It's really a separate country.
Right. And they've done something similar to that, modeled off that in Dubai.
Right.
So it's its own sovereign
section. You have the tremendous oil money coming in from the region to one central spot that then goes straight back to London.
Interesting.
And it funds, they're still funding the petrodollar. So a lot of these derivatives between London and Wall Street are tied up. Same thing with Singapore. When you go to Singapore and Malaysia, there's blocks where you start to see, every tire manufacturer company in the world. They move them to these places, close to material, cheap labor, send everything from a central shipping point. But since they're still Western-owned companies, they control the repatriation of capital. But you're unsectorally developing the first world countries. So with the global equilibrium ratio merging, the first world countries aren't first world anymore. I think everybody realized that. But I'm trying to get to, it still is a function of economic growth, population growth, and the two trends of technology population growth over time, and the two secondary trends of jobs moving south, people moving north. But the profits still go back to the main banking center. So if the profits start to shift to Moscow and Beijing and London collapses, the derivative market collapses, and you have another 2008 meltdown.
Wow.
Now you get to see why I compare my models to what Tom Luongo and Alex Craner are talking about, and there's a synergy there.
Yeah. But you have a lot of detail that I haven't heard kind of like fleshed out into, in this level of detail anywhere else. So very impressive stuff here, George. We're coming up on time here, George. Let's go ahead and wrap things up here. Where do people find you? Thank you so much for your time. If people want to get in touch with you or they want to see more of your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, let's put that slide set back up real quick, if you can, real quick.
Sure.
I think the easiest thing is where is that? Let me. I think the easiest thing to do is if people, I don't know, will that QR code show up on your video?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, then in that case, people can just click it.
Okay. We'll also have a link to it down below in the description as well.
Okay. Do that, and they can look me up on LinkedIn as George McMillan. I don't like to interact with people on Telegram. I like to know what people's names are and where they work.
Yep.
Because I'm not supposed to be dealing with with foreign entities. Mm-hmm. I had an old Telegram channel, and I got a friend of mine from one of the agencies, and he's talking about so many. He thought there were a lot of SVR FSB people in my Telegram chats, so I'm trying to keep them out.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I really, the only people that listen to me, because I go into so much academic detail and theoretical modeling, is financial analysts and intel analysts. So I kind of want to know who I'm dealing with so I don't get anybody in trouble, including myself.
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I think this was a very heavy dose of information and geopolitical insights that I haven't heard anywhere else. I'm going to have to watch this over again. I know a big portion of the audience will as well. Yeah. George, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on. Guys, if you enjoyed this podcast, drop us a like and comment. Go, George, go in the comment section. If you disagreed with anything, that's fine too. Let me know what you disagreed on. I do read the comments. Also, check out our good sponsors down below. We've got an amazing list of sponsors where you can get exclusive discounts on newsletters like Capitalist Exploits, which is my #1 favorite newsletter, the Trends Journal, which is Gerald Salente's newsletter, highly in-depth research, 200 plus pages in the last edition of the Trends Journal. So you're getting a tremendous amount of value, and you also get a 10% off discount by using the link down below, and a number of other great sponsors and affiliates. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for watching. Check me out on Substack. It's capitalcosm.substack.com to get early access, ad-free versions, uncensored versions of all my videos for the ones that warrant it. All right. See you later.